back to World Crisis Radio, Webster Tarpley, Washington, D.C. Follow me on Twitter, Webster G. Tarpley, and, of course, at tarpley.net, tarpley.net, where you can see these various media interviews, among other things. The question, therefore, is what happened overnight and what was instrumental in forcing Mubarak to relinquish his post when it seemed that his support in the military had been quite solid. On the evening of Thursday, we had Fareed Zakaria, that great expert wired into the U.S. intelligence community, stating on CNN, the Army has now definitively chosen to back Mubarak, and that was then reiterated in the communique of the Joint Military Command on Friday morning, the 11th. We support the Mubarak transition, let him stay through September, and make the constitutional changes. And then very soon after that, Al Jazeera starts saying, and Al Arabiya, an immediate announcement of grave importance is expected from the president, blah, blah, blah. And within an hour or two, Suleiman comes out and says Mubarak has quit. So it looks to me, just on the basis of what I've been able to assemble in the first couple of hours, that the impulse for Mubarak to quit does not come from a collapse of military support, but rather from the international threats, pressure, blackmail, arm-twisting, God knows what, exercised by the usual imperialist suspects in Washington and London. Don't forget London, because that seems to be the place where the family, some of them, had taken refuge, including quite possibly Mubarak's wife. So I think all of those are the things to look at. What this also means is, do not believe these idiotic commentaries that say, well, the demonstrators in the streets, those wonderful kids, were able to impose their will on this entrenched and sclerotic establishment. No way. This gaggle in the square, there might have been a few more of them today than before. I don't think until today they got much over 50,000. And again, if there's photographic proof, send it on in. But the Oceanic crowd's just not there, perhaps more today than before, but even that in some question because of this silly trick of filling that square with tents so that you could make the people who showed up look to be more even when they might have been less. I don't see any way that simply these relatively modest demonstrations could have forced an establishment based on an army and a state apparatus and state security forces to give up power. It had to be international pressure coming from the U.S. regarding Mubarak's family, his own future, or simply the chaos that could be created in Egypt by a complete and utter cutoff of food shipments. That is the typical way the U.S. squeezes Egypt. Now, in departing, Mubarak, I think, under the blackmail that I believe has gone on, shredded the Constitution by saying, I am essentially abdicating in favor of the military council. Well, that's not the Constitution. I believe that the Egyptian Constitution says that the vice president, Suleiman, should have taken over. Maybe that was too centralized, too much potential there for Suleiman to emerge as a strong leader, some kind of a central figure of authority. Who knows? Widely disliked, but nevertheless might have been able to rule with a fairly firm hand. Instead, what you've got now is a military junta. It's a junta like in Latin America. The military council is a junta. The military council is now like the state committee for the emergency in Moscow in 1991, but it's made up all military men. And here we find Tantawi, the defense minister, and General Sami Anan, the military chief of the general staff, who were both in Washington that fateful week of the 25th, 26th, 27th, 28th of January. Is it that Tantawi and Anan are the main U.S. puppets? I have the impression that the original U.S. intent was to stampede Mubarak into quitting on January 28th, on that Friday, when the violent demonstrators, violent arsonists burned down that large building, the headquarters of the ruling party, burned many police stations across the country, lynched police officers, and staged an armed attack with firearms and machine guns and other weapons on the Interior Ministry, where they had a pitched firefight with the police. This was violent from the word go. But apparently the goal of the U.S. was to drive Mubarak out of power into exile already on the 28th, 29th of January. It did not work, and he held on, therefore, for 2 more weeks. Now, what has been gained through the resistance offered by Mubarak is that the CIA nature of this coup is now openly displayed for the world to see. The coup that finally overthrew Mubarak was announced by Panetta, Leon Panetta, the head of the CIA, in testimony to the House Intelligence Committee on the morning of February 10th, 2011. It's a CIA coup. It's now a CIA-backed military junta with these reputed now U.S. puppets in command. It is a junta of CIA puppets running the country, and their authority, of course, is contested. I think El-Baradei is already demanding that he get a piece of the action. You've got to share power with us civilians, says El-Baradei. It is a leap into the dark. Chaos has come closer to that extent. The process is only beginning. Right? There are 30 years of pent-up resentments and angers. There's a whole series of economic demands, which we want to talk about in a little while. All of this is now unleashed. It's a leap in the dark, and nobody knows. Now, let me just point to one possible positive feature. The tradition in Egypt has been from time to time that the relatively junior officers stage the coup at the expense of the senior officers. And this is more or less what happened when you had the rule of King Farouk, the corrupt King Farouk, under British imperialism in the early 1950s, right? Egypt had been a colony seized by the British around 1880 and kept until the late 1940s, 1950, thereabouts. This is when the British began to leave Egypt, although they wanted to keep the Suez Canal. When King Farouk was overthrown, you had a kind of a transition period where you had a couple of military leaders and some other things, and then finally you had the coup d'etat of the colonels, of the younger officers, not Tantawi, not Sami Anan, but others. There's also a question that whereas the army seems to be dominating right now, the Air Force may still be heard from. The Air Force may be resentful that their guy Mubarak has been kicked out. Maybe the Air Force feels that they don't have enough seats on the military junta that the CIA has now created. We'll be back in just a minute.